Let's take a look at the first charge in the indictment against Donald Trump for attempting to steal the United States presidency, which reads, quote, "Conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government, 18 U.S. Code 371, end quote. To quote the legal code, conspiracy to defraud the United States is, quote, "if two or more persons conspire either to commit any offense against the United States or to defraud the United States or any agency thereof in any manner or for any purpose, and one or more of such persons do any act to affect the object of the conspiracy," end quote. This was rephrased by Chief Justice William Howard Taft, also the 27th president, in the opinion he authored for the 1924 case Hammerschmidt v. United States, thusly, quote, "To conspire to defraud the United States means primarily to cheat the government out of property or money, but it also means to interfere with or obstruct one of the lawful government functions by deceit, craft, or trickery, or at least by means that are dishonest," end quote. The indictments list 6 co-conspirators to this charge. Co-Conspirator One is described as, quote, "an attorney who is willing to spread knowingly false claims and pursue strategies that the Trump 2020 re-election campaign attorneys would not," end quote. Later in the indictment, Co-Conspirator One is said to have, quote, "left a voicemail intended for a United States senator that said, 'We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we can get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow," end quote. In January 2021, CNN reported that Rudy Giuliani left this voicemail for Senator Tommy Tuberville, so Co-Conspirator One is Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani's attorney confirmed this to the New York Times. Notably, Giuliani is also currently fighting a lawsuit filed against him by a former employee accusing him of sexual assault and harassment. Audio tapes were filed in that case the day after this indictment was made public that contained Giuliani making sexually vulgar and anti-Semitic remarks. Included in this lawsuit is the claim that Giuliani was shopping pardons on behalf of Trump, the proceeds from which he allegedly claimed he would split with Trump. Co-Conspirator Two is described as, quote, "an attorney who devised and attempted to implement a strategy to leverage the vice president's ceremonial role overseeing the certification proceeding to obstruct the certification of the presidential election," end quote. Later in the indictment, Co-Conspirator Two is alleged to have, quote, "circulated a 2-page memorandum outlining a plan for Mike Pence to unlawfully declare Trump the certified winner of the presidential election," end quote. This refers to the Eastman memos, making Co-Conspirator Two John Eastman, a former attorney for Trump. Co-Conspirator Three is described as, quote, "an attorney whose unfounded claims of election fraud Trump privately acknowledged to others sounded crazy." The indictment later mentions Co-Conspirator Three, quote, "filed a lawsuit against the governor of Georgia falsely alleging massive election fraud accomplished through the voting machine company's election software and hardware," end quote, making Co-Conspirator Three Sidney Powell. This is important because having Trump on record as describing Powell's claims, which Trump himself repeated, as crazy, helps establish that Trump knew his election claims were dubious, which helps establish corrupt intent. Co-Conspirator Four is described as, quote, "a Justice Department official who worked on civil matters and who, with Trump, attempted to use the Justice Department to open sham election crime investigations and influence state legislatures with knowingly false claims of election fraud," end quote. Later, the indictment describes actions by Co-Conspirator Four meant to coerce the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General in signing Co-Conspirator Four's draft letter that he intended to send to all contested states that would further the fraudulent elector scheme. As detailed in the Senate report on Trump's efforts to use the Justice Department to overturn the 2020 election, published in November of 2021, this is describing the behavior of Jeffrey Clark. Co-Conspirator Five is described as, quote, "an attorney who assisted in devising and attempting to implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding," end quote. Later, the indictment describes an email Co-Conspirator Five sent to Giuliani on December 13th with notes regarding the fake elector plots. This description matches an email published by the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack sent by Kenneth Chesebro. Finally, Co-Conspirator Six is described as, quote, "a political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding," end quote. Later, the indictment describes an email sent by Co-Conspirator Six to Giuliani, quote, "regarding attorneys who could assist in the fraudulent elector effort in the targeted states," end quote. The New York Times has since obtained this email and confirmed that Co-Conspirator Six is Boris Epshteyn, an investment banker and strategic political advisor to Trump. This charge alleges that Donald Trump and these co-conspirators conspired to, quote, "impair, obstruct, and defeat," end quote, "the federal government function for collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the U.S. presidential election." Established through the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act of 1887, this process involves electors who are chosen by each state according to state laws, usually based on the popular vote. After the election, states ascertain and certify their electors, who then meet to cast electoral votes reflecting their state's popular vote. These votes are sent to Congress to be officially counted and certified. The process concludes with a joint session of Congress on January 6th, presided over by the Vice President to announce the president's president-elect. This procedure is described in the indictment as, quote, being foundational to the United States' democratic process, end quote. The indictment describes 5 ways in which Donald Trump and his co-conspirators sought to impede, obstruct, and defeat this function. First, the indictment alleges that Trump and his co-conspirators used knowingly false claims of election fraud to manipulate state legislatures and election officials and sought to subvert legitimate election results by persuading officials in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin to, quote, ignore the popular vote, disenfranchise millions of voters, dismiss legitimate electors, and ultimately cause the ascertainment of and voting by illegitimate electors in favor of Trump, end quote. The indictment establishes that the claims used were knowingly false by citing numerous examples of Trump being informed that the claims were false, including senior leaders of the Justice Department appointed by Trump telling him on multiple occasions that the claims were unsupported, the Director of National Intelligence telling Trump that allegations of foreign interference were unfounded, the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency stating publicly that there existed no evidence that voting systems were compromised, and state and federal courts rejecting lawsuits brought by Trump and his co-conspirators on the basis that the lawsuits had no merit. The indictment lists several examples of Trump and his co-conspirators manipulating and pressuring government officials to aid and carry out his conspiracy, including Giuliani pressuring the Arizona House Speaker to decertify Arizona's election results, Trump calling and pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State to change Georgia's popular vote count, and Trump holding a meeting with the Michigan House Speaker and Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate in the Oval Office to pressure them into supporting his false claims of election fraud. Second, they are alleged to have organized fraudulent slates of electors in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. This included having fraudulent electors meet, cast false votes for Trump, and sign certificates misrepresenting themselves as legitimate. Some were deceived into participation with false promises that their votes would be only used if specific lawsuits succeeded. The false certificates were then transmitted to Pence and other officials for certification on January 6. Third, they are alleged to have tried to conduct fake election crime investigations under the power and authority of the Justice Department. They allegedly sent letters to targeted states falsely claiming the Justice Department had found issues that might have influenced the election and promoting fraudulent electors as a legitimate alternative. The letters also urged the targeted states' legislatures to convene and provide an opportunity to choose fraudulent electors over the legitimate ones. Fourth, they are alleged to try to get Pence to use his ceremonial role on January 6 to unlawfully change the election results. Initially, they used false claims of election fraud in an attempt to persuade Pence to accept fraudulent electors and reject or divert legitimate votes. When that didn't work, they repeated the false claims to supporters on January 6th, wrongly stating that Pence might change the election results and directed them to the Capitol to interfere with the certification and pressure Pence to take the fraudulent actions he had earlier declined. Fifth, and finally, when it was revealed on January 6th that Pence would not unlawfully change the election results, a crowd, many of who Trump had misled into thinking Pence could alter the election outcome, violently stormed the Capitol and stopped the proceeding. During the ensuing violence, Trump and his co-conspirators took advantage of the chaos by intensifying their efforts to spread false allegations of election fraud, attempting to persuade members of Congress to further postpone the certification based on those fraudulent claims. There are more details and examples for all of this in the indictment, and I encourage you to go read it, but that's essentially the gist of the first charge. I think the primary challenge here will be convincing the jury that Trump had corrupt intent. Now, I've heard many commentators suggest that this requires that the prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump didn't actually believe that the election had been stolen, but I don't buy that. I think it will be enough to simply prove that he was willing to use certifiably false information to overturn the election, and it seems like there's more than enough evidence of that here. If it didn't matter to Trump whether he could prove that the election was stolen, it's hard to argue that he legitimately cared about whether it was stolen. If he was willing to tell state officials that the Justice Department had evidence that he knew it didn't have, then it's easier to establish that his intent was entirely independent of the truth. And proving corrupt intent is easier when you have Trump being quoted as telling Pence that he was being too honest in refusing to participate in the conspiracy. Ultimately, I think this really comes down to whether every jury member fundamentally believes that what he did should be a crime. But what do you think? Should a former president be able to be charged by the Justice Department on conspiracy to defraud the United States for this kind of behavior? Does the indictment show enough evidence for a conviction? What else does the prosecution need to present at trial to remove reasonable doubt? If you don't think Trump committed a crime here, let me ask you this. If Joe Biden loses the next election, should he be allowed to try to get state officials to change vote counts? Should he be allowed to try to certify illegitimate electors? What would he be allowed to do to maintain power regardless of the outcome of the election? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back soon to cover the other charges.